Welcome to colleagues who are in the room, and it's very nice to see so many people who have come, and welcome to those who are online today. As I say, my name is Marcia Meskim, and I'm the director of the Institute of Advanced Studies, and we are very delighted to be welcoming today Alison Jane Martingano, who has come to us as an IAS visiting fellow, and who has been working with my colleague Nima Trivedi-Bateman, who is going to do the formal introduction. So I am only doing the IAS part. What I would say is the IAS is the dedicated hub in the university for both international and interdisciplinary core research and collaborative research. And this discussion of empathy today really demonstrates the power of that, because the interest that the topic and the word itself has had from colleagues across disciplines in the institution has been really exciting to us. It's clear that there is that it is time for a new perspective on empathy, but it is time to be actually mobilizing questions around empathy and from a range of different fields. And so we are really excited to have whatever questions people want to raise and whatever dialogue there can be from across those areas today in this seminar. So welcome to everyone. And if I can turn to you, Nima, to do a more formal introduction.
Yeah, of course. Hi, everyone. So I'm Nima, and so I'm delighted to have been hosting Dr. Martingano for the last 2 weeks. We've been writing a paper together in this 2 weeks about overcoming barriers to carrying out interventions with young people that attempt to encourage behavioural change and includes components of empathy. So we've had a really productive few weeks together and very enjoyable few weeks, lots of data deciphering, lots of analysis. So Dr. Martingano joins us from the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay, from the psychology department there. Her main research interests around interventions and designing interventions to increase empathy. She's particularly interested in whether practicing someone else's perspective can promote empathy, and has explored the potential for VR and other emerging technologies to achieve this. And I'm sure you'll join me in welcoming her to the talk today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm so thrilled to be here and to be hosted to work with Nima for the last 2 weeks. It's been great. This is quite an emotional last day to be saying goodbye, but I just really appreciate everybody here at the Institute of Advanced Studies and all the support of students. I'll be presenting a new perspective on empathy. Being really upfront at the beginning, this is my new perspective on empathy, and I'm going to try and convince you that it's right. But I realize right up front that it's brand new and maybe it's not right. So hopefully you'll all be interested and hopefully give me some ideas too about how to think about this. Before we start, I thought I'd better go over. No, of course. There we go. I thought I'd better talk about what empathy is. Empathy really is a buzzword. You hear about it all the time now. You can't help but scroll through social media, and it's really aesthetically pleasing images telling you you need to be more empathic all the time. It's been mentioned in speeches by President Barack Obama, and a very popular book called Against Empathy, which is taking the other side of the story. But basically, the word is out there and it means lots of different things. It also means lots of different things to scholars in the area. There is not a unified definition of empathy. And actually, Daniel Batson, who's a large scholar in the area, said that there's many definitions of empathy as there are researchers in the field. And I think that's probably true. So I want to try and acknowledge that today and talk about various different things that have been encapsulated under the umbrella of empathy. But I want to acknowledge that there are other things people have added in. And there are also some of the things I'm going to talk about, other people would say, do not classify as empathy, should not be under the definition. So if you really disagree with one of these components, I can get on board with that too. So I'm going to talk about the things that I'm going to call empathy for this talk. Starting off with empathic concern, which I think is probably the most prototypical type of empathy. This is feelings of concern and compassion and warmth for somebody else who's going through distress. So if somebody comes up to you and tells you a distressing story and those feelings start becoming aroused in you, that would be empathic concern. And we have emotion contagion. This is sometimes called emotion matching. This is the idea of feeling what somebody else feels. So if you're feeling sad, I feel sad. If you're happy, I feel happy. We also have perspective taking. This is the ability to take somebody else's perspective, to transpose yourself and put yourself into their shoes. This can be done in a variety of different ways. I'm not going to make too many fine-grained distinctions about how we take people's perspective. You could, for example, imagine how you would feel in their shoes, or you could imagine how they feel in their shoes. So a distinction there, but that's perspective taking. I'm also going to talk about emotional recognition. So this is the ability to accurately recognize how someone else is feeling. We often do this from facial expression, but it could also be from the voice, body language, things like that. And lastly, I want to touch on personal distress. This is probably the most controversial thing I'm going to include under this definition. This is the idea that you become distressed when somebody else is distressed. It's closely linked to emotional behavior because of that. So if you're the sort of person who goes to pieces in an emergency situation when you see other people distressed, you're probably quite high on this characteristic. Traditionally, these different types of empathy have been grouped into two large umbrella categories: cognitive and emotional empathy. Emotional empathy is something called affective empathy. So under the emotional empathy category, we have empathic concern, personal distress, and emotional contagion. These are all having an emotional response to somebody else. You can think of this sort of empathy with your heart. On the other side, we have empathy with your head, or an ability to understand how someone else is thinking or feeling. You don't necessarily have to have any emotional reaction to come under cognitive empathy. Here you're just understanding. You could understand without necessarily caring. I'm going to argue for a new perspective on empathy, though. So instead of this, I think we should think about empathy like this. So what I have along the bottom of the screen here is a continuum. I'm going to try and argue that some of these types of empathy are more automatic, and some of these types of empathy are more deliberate, that take more conscious effort for us to engage in. You can kind of think of this if you're a fan of system oriented processing, then Kahneman, thinking fast, thinking slow, same kind of distinction. So on the left here, we have the more automatic types of empathy. I'm going to argue that these are rapid, they're fast, these emotions come quickly. They're automatic. By that I mean they can be done without conscious control. You don't have to think about it in order for these types of empathy to happen. And then you can do them in the face of distraction. Even if something else is going on, you can still empathize in these automatic ways. That's the last one. Okay, on the other side, we have the more deliberate types of empathy. These are slow. They can still be pretty fast in the great scheme of things, maybe taking a few seconds, but they're certainly not instantaneous. They're more deliberate. They require us to consciously think about it. And if we're distracted, we struggle to do these things. So if I was a really great researcher, I would have come up with this theory sitting in a bathtub, and then I would have tested it empirically. The truth is it didn't quite work that way, so I'm going to be a little bit more honest about how it came to this, and talk to you about the various research studies that I conducted, that I'd observed the results from, and then came up with this theory at the end of it. So I sort of told you the end story at the beginning of the presentation here. And now I'm going to try and show you why I think empathy in this perspective. All right. The first thing that got me thinking about empathy and how automatic or not it was virtual reality. So this is a pretty famous TED Talk, although it's starting to date now. It's from 2015, where Chris Milk talks about virtual reality as the ultimate empathy machine, which is a pretty bold claim for anybody to make about anything. But I was particularly surprised he was making it about virtual reality. Because virtual reality to me is the sort of technology that wouldn't necessarily simultaneously enhance every type of empathy. And hopefully that sentence will become clearer as I go on. So I wanted to do, like any good scientist, a good experiment to see whether virtual reality really does enhance empathy. I'll talk you through those results now. So this was a classic experimental randomized control trial. I had participants come into the lab, and they were randomly assigned to either experience virtual reality or a control group. Afterwards, we measured their empathy with various different measures. Then I paid them $10 in $1 bills. And just as they were leaving, there was a donation bucket there from UNICEF, and I looked at how much money they donated. These were the three different conditions that I had in my experiment. I had my experimental condition, which is the virtual reality condition. The virtual reality experience I did not design. I am not a graphic designer. I used one already created by the New York Times. It's a wonderful 360 video that follows some children who are escaping war in various different countries around the world, follows them and they tell their story. It's about 12 minutes long. Then I had two control groups. One of the control groups was an audiobook control. What I wanted here was a control group where the same content was given, but not in VR format, so that I could check the real power of VR against something more traditional, like reading. Luckily, the authors at the New York Times have written some beautiful pieces that told the same story as the VR video. So again, I didn't write these, I'm not an excellent author, but these were largely comparable to what happened in the VR and incredibly well written. What I did was I put it into a virtual reality headset and made the text scroll across the screen, Star Wars style, whilst the audio was running on in the background. Then I had another control group, which is my most boring control group. My participants did not like being in this group. They had to sit in a virtual reality waiting room. They just sat there for 12 minutes. And people walked by, but basically nothing really happened. The idea was this was high quality, high fidelity, 360 VR, but no content at all, nothing there to make it happen. The measures of empathy I used were broadly questionnaire-based. This question is based on the Interpersonal Reactivity Index by Mark Davis, which is a commonly used questionnaire measure of empathy, which I just slightly tweaked so that I was measuring empathy in the moment as opposed to empathy as a trait, how that scale is designed. I also used an emotion recognition task, which shows people's faces, expressing different emotions for a few seconds on the screen, and they have to kind of accurately perceive their emotions. This was my sample. This research was done in New York City, not in Wisconsin. So I did get a more ethnically diverse sample, but it was more liberal and more educated than sort of classic American. So for the results, straight on. Okay, so these were my results for the emotion recognition score. What you can see here is nothing. There was no difference between any of the conditions for emotion recognition. So it seems that this VR experience does not improve your ability to recognize emotions. But maybe nobody was really exciting. These are the questionnaire results for the two types of emotional empathy, personal distress and empathic concern. You can actually see the same trend for both of these types of empathy. So the pale pink bar here is representing the virtual reality condition that is scoring highest on empathic concern and on personal distress. The second highest bar here is the audiobook, so that's having some impact on empathy, but not quite as much. And the third highest bar here is the waiting room control group. So this is suggesting that VR does decrease empathy. These emotional types of empathy are both right. I do have the questionnaire results for perspective taking. These are a tad more confusing. Here we see no difference, no statistical difference, that is, between the audiobook and the VR, but both are scoring higher than that waiting room controller, which suggests that for that particular type of empathy, perspective taking, maybe a book is as effective as VR. For anybody interested in the donation results, these are the donation results. Sadly, nothing going on here. VR did not increase donation. Neither did the audiobook in comparison to the control group. Remember, the control group just sat in a waiting room for 12 minutes. This is not totally relevant to my empathy perspective that I'm talking about, but I think very practically important for philanthropic organizations that are investing huge amounts of money in VR, and maybe they want to reconsider that a little bit. Okay, so let's come back to my perspective on empathy. So these are the types of empathy that I measured in this particular experiment. What we see here is that VR seems to increase these two types of empathy that I'm classifying as more automatic. It doesn't seem to have an impact, or at least not a unique impact of a written text or these more deliberate types of empathy. So this was the first piece of data that I had that suggested that there's some kind of split going on here. You'll notice though that this split fits the traditional emotional cognitive distinction. So I wanted to see whether this finding from my experiment was just a one-off or not. So I decided to do a meta-analysis. Anybody that's ever done a meta-analysis will tell you not to do a meta-analysis. It's a very long process, but basically I read an awful lot of articles and I came down to 43 studies that I could actually include these were other experiments that had done the same thing as me. And I wanted to average their effect. Of these 43 articles, almost all of them were published in articles, so there I did have a few others. These are the main results for the meta-analysis. What we see here is the same thing as what I saw in my experiment. The emotional types of empathy are on average increased by VR, and the cognitive types of empathy are on average not increased by VR. Worth noting that all of these different studies have very different VR experiences. They measured empathy in very different ways, but this same overall trend is there. So that was just another piece of evidence that also puts VR over here on the increasing emotional empathy side of the diagram. It also allows me to add in emotional contagion, which I didn't measure, but was measured by other people. To some other work that I've done that looks sort of the other side of this story. Piece of research I did on the power of listening. Although really, maybe I should have entitled it The Power of Eavesdropping, because that was actually what I was interested in. So imagine you're in a bar, you should say, there's a couple of people over here and they're talking. But for some reason, whatever it is, they don't really understand each other. Sometimes as the impartial observer, you know that they're not understanding each other. Oh, if only she would explain it this way. That was the phenomenon I wanted to look at. I wanted to argue that the person listening in, the person eavesdropping on that conversation, has to work a lot harder in order to understand what's going on than the people in the conversation. In other words, they have to use their empathy muscles a little bit more in order to understand. They have to rely on perspective taking, emotional recognition in order to figure out what's going on. The people in the conversation can just ask them the questions, Oh. So to test this, I ran another experiment in New York. It was difficult to run because I had to bring trios of strangers into the laboratory at the same time. And of course, they would cancel and then I had the wrong number. But I was supposed to have 3 people in the lab at the same time, all who didn't know each other. Then I would randomly allocate them to be either a listener or a conversational participant. This is my sample, similar to the last one. It's in New York. So I have my conversational participants. They would sit in a room on either sides of a table, and there was a visual barrier between them. It's a fancy word for a piece of cardboard. And down the hall, in a totally different room, there were my listeners. They were also seated at a computer. They had headphones on, and audio from these guys in this room was being piped down into this room. So my listeners were hearing their conversation, but they couldn't see it. And then I got them to do a task in order to try and measure how well my listeners understood what the conversational participants were doing. So I had them do a tangram matching test. What does this mean? It means that in my conversational participants, one of them was the director and one of them was the matcher. The director sort of screen like this, where 6 images were placed in a grid. The matcher scored an empty grid and all the images down the side. The director's job was to describe where the images were, and the matcher had to drag and drop them into the correct box. So the director might say something like, oh, position 1, it looks like a man walking to the left. And the listener might think, oh, okay, does he look kind of sad? And then the director might say, sad. And they go back and forth with each other until they magically satisfy they've got all of these. The eavesdropper, the listener sitting down the hall, was trying to do exactly the same task. But of course, they couldn't ask any questions. They had to do it by simply trying to understand that there are these 2 people around them. Then after I got them to do that task for 20 minutes, I measured their empathy, same questions as before, nothing new there. Although I did change the emotion recognition task slightly. This is an emotion recognition task. You have to recognize the emotion from the eyes, it's a little bit more difficult. These are the results for the emotion recognition task, the reading the mind task. Here we actually do see a significant difference. Not a very big one, I'll grant you, but my conversational participants are scoring a little bit less than the listeners on this task after doing that listening activity for 20 minutes. So it seems that trying to listen in, working your empathy muscles, as I would argue it, for 20 minutes, is then leading to improved ability to recognize emotions afterwards. Now I have the results for those questionnaire measures. What we see here is a significant, I've just noticed that the colors are a little bit wrong here. The dark bars here are my listeners, and the checkered bars are the conversation participants. So here you see that the listeners are reporting more empathic concern than the conversation participants. They're also reporting higher levels of perspective taking than the conversation participants. The only type of empathy that doesn't seem to be different between these two groups is that personal distress type of empathy. So here we're seeing different results for these two different types of emotion. So if we take that back to my perspective, I'm going to argue that it means that listening increases these more deliberate types of empathy, perspective taking, emotion recognition, and also empathic concern in that experiment. But it doesn't increase personal distress. I didn't actually measure emotion. But I'm trying to place listening on the other side of the grid here, as listening in being an opportunity to practice these more deliberate, effortful types of empathy consciousness. So we're doing all this. Okay. Next thing I want to talk about, I'm going to talk about two studies here actually that are not experiments. These are both they're both correlational pieces of research. I want to make that super clear because I don't want you to go away from this thinking that social media has shown that it does move your empathy one way or another. But I'm interested in how it's related to our empathy. So people who use social media frequently, how is that impacting them? How is that related to the empathy skills? This was a larger sample, but less diverse. Mostly these are college students taking this survey. I asked them about their empathy levels. This is actually the interpersonal reactivity index that's not been modified, so it's dispositional levels of empathy here, and emotion recognition, measuring that too. And I asked them a very simple question about how frequently they use social media. I asked this 3 different ways: how frequently do you use Facebook, how frequently do you use Instagram, how frequently do you use Twitter. You can tell that I'm a little behind the times because I didn't ask about TikTok, but obviously let's do it now. And these were the correlations I found. So what you can see here is a negative correlation between emotion recognition and social media use. That means the more social media you use, the less well you're scoring on that emotion recognition tab. Although I'll point out that this is not really statistically significant. We do see, however, a statistically significant negative correlation with perspective. That means the more you're reporting using social media, the less highly you're scoring on the perspective taking questionnaire. And then we also see a negative correlation, although not significant, with emotion, empathic concern. Where we see the positive correlation is personal distress. So people who use social media more regularly are reporting higher levels of personal distress. So again, we're seeing a bit of a split here. We're seeing that social media use is associated with higher levels of personal distress and lower levels of rotating with other types of empathy, which on my screen will put social media at the same end as virtual reality. One more piece of research, another correlational piece of research on reading fiction. There's been a lot of work done on reading fiction and its effects on the theory of mind and empathy. This is just one of those many. So just for those who are not familiar with this body of research, what's the difference between literary and fiction? It's a somewhat controversial distinction, I suppose. But my understanding of it is that popular fiction is fiction where you are told the story and you don't have to do a whole lot of interpretation as the reader. Whereas literary fiction, you have to work to build the story yourself a lot of the time. And I have some examples of the different types of fiction. So to measure people's familiarity with literary and popular fiction, we didn't use that. We use this one. This is the author recognition test. Basically a very long list of authors, and you have to say which ones you recognize. There is a lot of pretend authors in here, fake names. You can't just circle everyone and you could look really well written. What we did then was divided it up into literary and popular authors, and so if you're recognizing a lot more popular authors, I'm going to assume you read a lot more popular fiction. Now we measured everybody's reading mind and eyes, ability to measure their emotion recognition. And here we have the correlations. So this is just measuring that one type of empathy, emotion recognition. And what we're seeing here is a positive, significantly positive relationship with literary fiction. So people who report, who recognize more literary fiction authors, probably read more literary fiction, are scoring higher on the emotion recognition task. The same effect of fiction does not seem to be true for popular fiction, it's only literary fiction. So how did that get me to this perspective? Because these were my results, and they were from various different projects I was working on, and I wanted to try and understand why certain activities increase certain types of empathy and other activities seem to increase other types of empathy. So I started thinking about what was similar between these activities. And this is where I'm hoping you'll follow my argument. So for me, virtual reality and frequently social media are the sort of activities where the story is told to you. Somebody will tell you exactly how they're feeling on social media. Sometimes they'll put up a very graphic image showing how they're feeling. In virtual reality, especially the VR, this 360 video, will very clearly show you the situation. You don't have to add a whole lot of interpretation in there. It's there for you. So in many ways, these technologies are doing the work for you. You don't need to figure out how someone else is thinking or feeling. It's going to tell you. Coming back to VR as the ultimate empathy machine. Maybe it kind of is, because it's doing all the work for you. What I would argue, though, is that if it's doing the work for you, you're not practicing it yourself. You're not learning those skills yourself. And so it's not ultimately going to lead you to be more empathic. Controversial. On the other side, we have listening or eavesdropping, which is a very ethical and difficult activity, but provides an opportunity for you to try and figure out what other people are thinking or feeling. A skill that I would argue you can practice and get better at. And so if you keep practicing it, you'll get better. Reading literary fiction may also be an example of an activity that you can practice understanding the mental states of other people in a fictional world to kind of figure out the motivations of that character or how they're feeling. And just because it's fictional doesn't mean that it's not good practice. And so that too may lead to higher levels of these more deliberative, resourceful types of empathy. So this leads me to conclude that different activities can impact these different types of empathy because they either arouse as more automatic, people are hurt, I feel bad, or they're an opportunity to practice these more deliberate types of empathy. So that leads me to a particular part of my advice for designers, for anybody working in this space where they want to try and increase empathy. First thing is you need to decide what type of empathy. Because unfortunately, my advice is going to say that the sort of activities that enhance one, probably not going to enhance the other. So you've got to picture that. For this sort of automatic type of empathy, we're talking about creating materials that are unambiguous, that are clear expressions of emotion. So philanthropic organizations with their advertisements for the crying child, they're going to arouse this type of empathy, and it's going to do it effectively. On the other hand, though, if we're interested in arousing those more deliberative, cognitive types of empathy, then you want to create ambiguous, difficult to decipher expressions of emotion, say, that challenge the user to figure out what's going on for themselves. I really love it. It creates something to both at the same time, but I think that's what I'm doing. Thank you so much for listening.